October 12, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Butner, North Carolina, carrying cargo that no one at the facility had expected to receive. 23 German women prisoners of war, captured during the final Allied push through France, sat in silence as American soil passed beneath them for the first time. They wore the tattered remains of their Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, gray fabric stained with the mud of retreat and the dust of a world crumbling around them. Among them was 24-year-old Greta Hoffmann, a former radio operator from Dresden, who clutched a small photograph of her mother and younger sister against her chest. She had been told by her superiors that capture by Americans meant certain death or worse. Yet here she sat, alive and unharmed, being transported to a destination unknown. The truck stopped outside a series of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing. Not the brutal prison camps of their imagination, but simple military structures that looked almost ordinary. Guards approached, but their weapons remained lowered, their expressions more curious than hostile. Captain William Reynolds, the officer assigned to oversee the women's section of the camp, stood waiting as the prisoners disembarked. He had served in the Pacific before being reassigned to this unusual duty, and the sight of female enemy combatants was something entirely new in his experience. These were not the hardened soldiers he had encountered in battle. They were young women, some barely out of their teens, looking exhausted and frightened despite their attempts to maintain military bearing. A young corporal named Thomas Miller stood beside Captain Reynolds, watching the women file past. Miller was only 21 himself, a farm boy from Georgia who had grown up during the Depression and knew what hunger looked like in a person's eyes. He saw it now in these German women, saw the way they moved with the careful economy of people who had learned not to waste energy on unnecessary movement. The camp's administrative building became a processing center as each woman was registered, photographed, and assigned a barracks number. Greta watched as her fellow prisoners answered questions through a translator, a middle-aged German-American woman named Mrs. Elizabeth Schneider, who had volunteered her services to the military. The questions were basic: name, rank, hometown, medical conditions. Nothing threatening, nothing cruel. It confused Greta more than violence would have. Throughout her service, she had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that their soldiers showed no mercy, that their country was a place of chaos and cruelty. Yet everything she had witnessed since her capture contradicted these teachings. The American soldiers who had captured her unit outside of Nancy had shared their rations with the hungry prisoners. The medical officers who examined them had treated their wounds with the same care they would show their own troops, and now this camp, which looked nothing like the hellish prisons described in German propaganda. As evening fell on that first day, the women were led to their barracks. The buildings were clean, with real beds instead of the dirt floors they had expected. Blankets were distributed, thin but serviceable. The October air was turning cold, and Greta wrapped herself in the rough wool, wondering what tomorrow would bring in this strange captivity that felt nothing like the stories she had been told. The first morning at Camp Butner began with a bugle call that startled the German women from uneasy sleep. Greta woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was, until the reality of wooden walls and unfamiliar faces reminded her. She was a prisoner in America, thousands of miles from everything she had ever known. The women dressed quietly, helping each other button uniforms and tie back hair with whatever scraps of ribbon or string they had managed to keep. There was an unspoken understanding among them that maintaining dignity meant maintaining appearance, even in captivity. They had been soldiers once, and some part of that identity clung to them despite their changed circumstances. An American guard, a middle-aged sergeant named Robert Chen, appeared at the barracks door. His family had immigrated from China when he was a child, and he understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion, to be seen as perpetually foreign. He spoke slowly, using simple words and hand gestures to communicate that it was time for morning formation and breakfast. The women followed him across the compound to a large building that served as the camp mess hall. Greta had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. The final weeks before her capture had been chaotic, with supply lines broken and rations reduced to almost nothing. She had survived on stale bread and whatever could be scavenged from abandoned farms. The smell that greeted them as they entered the mess hall was overwhelming. Coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute they had been drinking for months. Eggs, she could smell eggs cooking. And something sweet, something she could not immediately identify, but that made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. The women were directed to form a line, just like American soldiers did. They were handed metal trays, and then they watched in disbelief as camp cooks began serving them portions of food that seemed impossibly generous. Scrambled eggs, more than Greta had seen in a single serving since before the war. Thick slices of bread with real butter, strips of bacon that glistened with fat, and fruit, precious fruit that had disappeared from German tables years ago. 22-year-old Liesl Werner, standing behind Greta in line, began to cry silently. The tears ran down her face as an American cook, a heavy-set black man named Corporal Washington, placed 2 additional strips of bacon on her tray. He noticed her tears, and his expression softened with something that looked like pity. The women carried their trays to assigned tables, moving mechanically, still processing what they were seeing. Around them, American soldiers ate casually, talking and laughing, as if this abundance was normal, as if food like this appeared at every meal without thought or gratitude. Greta sat down slowly, staring at her tray. This was enemy food, American food, and it represented everything she had been taught to despise about this country. Excess, waste, indulgence, while the rest of the world suffered. But her hands trembled as she picked up her fork, and her first bite of scrambled eggs tasted like nothing she could have imagined. For 3 days, the German women moved through Camp Butner in a state of suspended disbelief. Each meal brought the same impossible abundance. Each morning, the same generous portions appeared on their trays. They began to whisper among themselves during the brief moments when guards were not nearby, trying to make sense of what they were experiencing. Greta found herself watching the American soldiers more closely, studying them for signs of the cruelty she had been promised would come. But the guards remained consistently, frustratingly kind. They opened doors, offered assistance with heavy loads, and spoke in tones that suggested patience rather than contempt. It made no sense, according to everything she had been taught about America and Americans. On the 4th day, something changed in the mess hall routine. It was Sunday, October 15th, and the cooks had apparently decided to mark the day with something special. The women lined up as usual, but when they reached the serving counter, they found something unexpected waiting for them. Corporal Washington stood behind a large pan filled with what looked like fruit swimming in thick golden syrup, topped with a lattice of baked dough that had turned a perfect golden brown. The smell was intoxicating, a mixture of cinnamon, sugar, and something fruity that Greta could not quite identify. Through Mrs. Schneider, who had been brought in to help with communication, Corporal Washington explained what they were being served. "This here is peach cobbler," he said with obvious pride in his voice. "Made it myself this morning with peaches from Georgia. Figured you ladies might like something sweet after all you've been through." The translation hung in the air like an impossible promise. Peaches. Real peaches, not the ersatz fruit preserves that had been Germany's wartime substitute, but actual peaches baked into a dessert that required butter, sugar, flour, and all the resources that Germany had been desperately rationing for years. Each woman received a generous portion, the warm cobbler steaming slightly as it was spooned onto small plates. Greta carried hers back to the table with the same careful reverence she might show a precious artifact. Around her, the other women did the same, creating a strange, silent procession of enemy prisoners bearing American dessert. 20-year-old Anna Vogel was the first to taste it. She had been the youngest in their unit, barely old enough to serve, and she had joined the Auxiliary Corps with her mother's reluctant blessing only 8 months earlier. Now she lifted a spoonful of the cobbler to her lips, and her expression transformed. Her eyes widened, then closed, and a sound escaped her throat that was something between a gasp and a sob. The peach was soft, almost melting, sweet in a way that seemed impossible. The syrup carried flavors of vanilla and cinnamon. The crust on top provided a buttery contrast that completed something Anna had not realized was incomplete. This was not just food. This was abundance made manifest. Greta watched Anna's reaction for a long moment before she allowed herself to take her own first bite. The spoon felt heavy in her hand, weighted with more than just metal and cobbler. This simple act of eating felt like a betrayal of everything she had believed about the war, about Germany's cause, about the enemy she had been serving against. She had been told that America was a nation of excess built on the suffering of others, that their abundance came at the cost of the world's deprivation. But how could that explanation account for this moment, for the fact that their captors were sharing this abundance with prisoners, with enemies, with women who had worked to help kill American soldiers? The peach cobbler touched her tongue, and every rational thought vanished. The sweetness was almost shocking in its intensity. Real sugar, not the saccharine substitute that had characterized every German dessert for the past 3 years. The peaches were tender and full of flavor that tasted like summer itself, like orchards and sunshine, and a world where fruit grew so abundantly that it could be baked into desserts for prisoners. Greta had not cried since her capture. She had maintained her composure through the chaos of retreat, through the terror of surrender, through the uncertainty of transport to this American camp. But now, with the taste of peach cobbler on her tongue, tears began to roll down her face. She was not alone. Around the mess hall, the German women sat in various states of emotional breakdown. Some cried openly like Greta. Others sat frozen with spoons halfway to their mouths, unable to process what they were experiencing. A few ate mechanically, as if the simple act of consuming the dessert might help them understand it. Liesel Werner set her spoon down with a clatter that drew attention from nearby tables. "This is propaganda," she said in German, her voice tight with something that sounded like anger but might have been fear. "They are trying to confuse us, to make us forget who we are and what we are fighting for. This is a trick." But even as she spoke, her eyes remained fixed on the remaining cobbler on her plate, and her hand trembled with the obvious desire to take another bite despite her words. Mrs. Schneider, the translator, had been watching the women's reactions with an expression that mixed sympathy and sadness. She approached their table slowly, as if approaching frightened animals. "It is not a trick," she said softly in German. "This is simply how Americans eat. This is normal here. They do not understand that what is ordinary to them is impossible to you." Her words created a new kind of silence. If this was normal, if American soldiers ate like this regularly, then what did that mean about everything they had been told? Germany had been at war for 5 years, had sacrificed everything for the cause, had accepted starvation and deprivation as the price of victory. And here was America feeding even its prisoners with a casual abundance that suggested resources beyond imagination. That night in the barracks, the women could talk of nothing but the peach cobbler. They lay in their beds speaking in hushed German, as if afraid that even discussing the experience might somehow take it away, or reveal it as the illusion some of them still insisted it must be. Greta found herself replaying every moment of the meal, analyzing it for meaning, for hidden messages, for anything that might explain why their captors would waste such precious resources on enemy prisoners. "My mother has not tasted real sugar in 2 years, Anna said quietly from the bunk next to Greta's. "My little brothers do not even remember what fresh fruit tastes like. And we, prisoners, enemies, we ate peaches baked with butter and sugar as if it meant nothing." The unfairness of it hung in the air. They had served Germany faithfully, had believed they were defending their homeland against nations that wished to destroy them. Yet Germany had given them increasingly meager rations while asking for greater sacrifice. America, their supposed enemy, fed them better than their own country had in years. "It is because they have so much that they can afford to waste it even on us," Liesel offered, still trying to maintain the framework of explanation they had been given. "They are rich from exploiting others. That is what we were taught. This proves nothing except their excess." But her argument sounded hollow even to her own ears. There was a difference between excess and kindness, between waste and generosity. The American soldiers had not thrown food at them or forced them to grovel for it. They had served them the same portions they served their own men, had treated the act of feeding prisoners as if it were simply the obvious thing to do. Greta thought about Corporal Washington, the cook who had made the cobbler. He had smiled when he served them, had seemed genuinely pleased to offer them something special. There had been no cruelty in his expression, no superiority, just the satisfaction of someone sharing food they had prepared with care. It reminded her of her own father, a baker in Dresden, who had taken the same pride in his work. Before the war had reduced him to stretching flour with sawdust and calling it bread. Over the following days, the meals continued to arrive with the same impossible regularity. Breakfast brought oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins. Lunch included sandwiches made with real meat and fresh vegetables. Dinner featured roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans seasoned with bacon. And there was always bread, soft white bread or cornbread or biscuits, always with butter, always in quantities that seemed designed to demonstrate that scarcity was a choice rather than an inevitability. The women began to gain weight, their faces filling out, their movements becoming less careful and conserved. Their bodies responded to the nutrition even as their minds struggled to process the implications. They were becoming healthier as prisoners than they had been as free women serving their own country. The cognitive dissonance created a strange atmosphere in the barracks. Some women, like Liesel, retreated into denial and insisted that this was all part of some elaborate American plot. Others, like Anna, began to openly question everything they had been told about the war. Corporal James Washington had been cooking in the Army for 3 years, ever since he enlisted in 1941 from his home in rural Georgia. He was 34 years old, had grown up picking peaches in his father's small orchard, and understood food not just as sustenance, but as a language of care that transcended words. He had watched the German women's reactions to his peach cobbler with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because good food should provoke that kind of response, should remind people that pleasure and beauty still existed in the world. Sadness because their shock revealed how much they had been deprived, how thoroughly the war had stolen even simple joys from their lives. Washington had not expected to feel sympathy for enemy prisoners. He had cousins fighting in Europe, friends who had died at Normandy, and every reason to hate anyone who had worn a German uniform. But these women did not match the monsters described in propaganda films. They looked like his sister, like his neighbor's daughters, like any young women who had been caught up in circumstances beyond their control. On the Wednesday following the peach cobbler incident, Washington decided to make another special dessert. This time it was apple pie, made with apples from a local North Carolina farm and seasoned with cinnamon he had been saving for something worthwhile. He prepared 6 pies, enough for generous slices for all the German women and the American personnel assigned to their section of the camp. When the women entered the mess hall that evening and saw the pies cooling on the counter, their reactions were more controlled than before, but no less profound. They had learned to expect abundance now, but expectation did not diminish wonder. Greta received her slice and carried it to her usual table, but this time she paused before eating. She looked across the mess hall to where Corporal Washington stood, and in careful, heavily accented English she had been secretly practicing, she said, "Thank you." The words were simple, but they represented a bridge being built, a recognition that kindness deserved acknowledgement regardless of the uniform it wore. Washington nodded, understanding that her thanks carried weight beyond the immediate gesture. Other women began to follow Greta's example, offering their own halting English thanks or simply nodding with genuine gratitude. The atmosphere in the mess hall shifted subtly. The invisible wall between captors and prisoners, between Americans and Germans, began to develop small cracks. Mrs. Schneider, who witnessed these exchanges, felt tears prick her eyes. She had left Germany in 1933, had watched from America as her homeland descended into madness, and had volunteered to help with prisoners, hoping she might serve as some kind of bridge between the two worlds she inhabited. These small moments of connection felt like the first steps towards something she had thought might be impossible: reconciliation. That evening, Washington received permission from Captain Reynolds to speak briefly with some of the German women through Mrs. Schneider's translation. He wanted to explain something that had been on his mind since their arrival. Through Mrs. Schneider's careful translation, Corporal Washington addressed a small group of German women who had gathered after the evening meal. Greta, Anna, and Liesel were among them, along with several others who had shown curiosity about the man who kept producing impossible desserts from the camp kitchen. "I wanted you to understand something," Washington began, his voice gentle but firm. "The food I make for you, it is not special prison food. It is not propaganda or tricks. This is how we eat in America. My family back in Georgia, they eat like this. Poor families, not rich people. This is normal for us." Mrs. Schneider translated, and the women's faces showed their struggle to accept this reality. If this was normal, if even poor Americans ate with such abundance, then what did that say about the war Germany had been fighting, about the sacrifices they had been told were necessary for survival? Washington continued, "I grew up during hard times. The Depression, we call it. I know what it is like to be hungry, to stretch one chicken across 3 meals for a family of 7. But even then, even in the hardest times, America had food. The land is rich here. We grow more than we can eat. That is not evil. That is just the truth." Greta listened to the translation and felt something fundamental shifting inside her understanding of the world. She thought about her father's bakery in Dresden, about how Germany had always struggled to feed itself even before the war, how the Nazis had promised that conquest would bring the living space and resources Germany needed to thrive. But what if the problem was not lack of space or resources? What if the problem was something else entirely, something she had never been allowed to question? Anna raised her hand tentatively, as if she were back in school. Through Mrs. Schneider, she asked, "Why do you share it with us? We are your enemies. We work to help kill American soldiers. Why waste this food on us?" Washington was quiet for a long moment before answering. "My grandmother was a slave," he said finally. "She was freed when she was 15 years old. She told me stories about being hungry, about watching food being thrown away while she starved, about being treated as less than human. She taught me that the measure of a person or a country is how they treat people who have no power, no ability to demand better treatment." He paused, making sure Mrs. Schneider had time to translate fully. "You are prisoners. You cannot fight back, cannot demand anything, cannot protect yourselves. If we treat you badly, it says nothing about you. It says everything about us. America is not perfect. We have many problems, but we try to believe that every person has dignity. Even enemies, maybe especially enemies, because that is when it matters most." The women sat in silence after the translation finished. These were not the words of a propaganda officer or a military commander. This was a black man from Georgia, from the American South, where racism was well known even in Germany, telling them about his grandmother's enslavement and his country's ideals in the same breath. The weeks following Corporal Washington's conversation brought subtle but profound changes to the dynamic at Camp Butner. The German women began attempting more English phrases, hesitant at first, but growing bolder with each successful communication. The American guards responded with patience, correcting pronunciation gently and praising effort enthusiastically. Greta found herself volunteering for kitchen duties, ostensibly to contribute to the camp's operation, but truthfully because she wanted to understand how food could appear with such reliable abundance. She watched as supplies arrived by truck every few days, noted how the storage rooms stayed consistently stocked, observed the casual way American soldiers treated resources that would have been precious treasures in Germany. One afternoon in early November, while helping to peel potatoes, Greta worked alongside a young private named David Brenner, whose family had emigrated from Germany in the 1920s. His German was rusty but functional, and he served as an informal translator when Mrs. Schneider was not available. "You seem surprised by everything in the kitchen," Brenner observed in German as they worked. "What did you expect to find here?" Greta considered her answer carefully. "We were told that America was weak, that you were soft and divided, that your soldiers had no discipline or courage. We were told your country was failing, that your people were starving because of your corrupt system." Brenner laughed, not unkindly. "And now? Now I do not know what to believe," Greta admitted. "Everything I see contradicts everything I was taught. Either you are all excellent actors performing an elaborate deception, or we were lied to about fundamental truths." The private set down his peeling knife and looked at her seriously. "My parents left Germany because they saw what was coming. They saw the hatred growing, the lies being told, the way truth was being twisted to serve power. They tried to warn family members to leave, but most did not believe them. Most thought Germany was finally becoming strong again after the humiliation of the last war." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Greta, I am going to tell you something that you will not want to hear, but you need to understand it. Germany did not lose this war because America was stronger or because you were betrayed. Germany lost because you were fighting for something evil, something that required constant lies to maintain, something that could only survive by controlling what people were allowed to know and think." The words hit Greta like physical blows, but she did not argue. She had been thinking similar thoughts in the quiet hours of night, had been unable to reconcile the America she had been promised with the America she was experiencing. In the barracks that evening, Greta shared her conversation with Anna and several other women who had become her closest companions in captivity. They gathered in a corner where they could speak quietly, away from Liesel and the few others who still clung desperately to their previous beliefs. November 23, 1944, arrived with cold rain that turned the camp's paths to mud. The German women woke to the sound of increased activity throughout the facility, American soldiers moving with purpose and unusual energy. Captain Reynolds had announced the previous day that Thursday would be Thanksgiving, an American holiday the German women knew nothing about. Through Mrs. Schneider, the tradition had been explained. A day of gratitude, of gathering, of feasting, to give thanks for blessings received. It seemed almost obscene to the German women that America, already so abundant, would dedicate an entire day to celebrating having more than enough. The mess hall had been decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves cut from colored paper. Long tables had been arranged differently than usual, with American soldiers and German prisoners assigned to sit together rather than in their usual separated sections. The change was deliberate, Captain Reynolds explained, because Thanksgiving was about community and shared humanity. When the food began arriving from the kitchen, the German women experienced a new level of disbelief. Whole roasted turkeys, golden brown and glistening with fat. Mashed potatoes in quantities that could have fed a German regiment. Stuffing made with bread, herbs, and butter. Sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows, a combination so strange and sweet it seemed almost insane. Green bean casserole with crispy onions on top. Cranberry sauce that wobbled perfectly on serving spoons. And pies. So many pies. Pumpkin, apple, pecan, each one a masterpiece of American plenty. Greta sat between Private Brenner and Anna, staring at her plate which held more food than she typically ate in an entire day. Around her, American soldiers ate with enthusiasm, but also with casual normalcy, as if meals like this were regular occurrences rather than once-in-a-lifetime miracles. Corporal Washington moved through the mess hall, checking on dishes and accepting compliments with obvious pride. When he reached the table where Greta sat, he paused and spoke to her directly in English, knowing she would understand at least some of his words. "This is my favorite holiday," he said, "because it reminds us that having enough is something to be grateful for, not something to take for granted or to hoard from others." The meal progressed with an atmosphere that felt almost dreamlike. American soldiers encouraged the German women to try everything, explaining dishes and sharing family traditions associated with various foods. Sergeant Chen described how his Chinese-American family had adapted Thanksgiving to include dishes from both cultures. Private Morrison talked about Thanksgivings on his Iowa farm, where neighbors would gather to share the harvest. As Greta took her first bite of turkey, moist and flavorful, in a way that German poultry had not been for years, she felt something break inside her. Not her spirit, but rather the shell of certainty that had surrounded her beliefs about the world. She had served Germany, believing it was the victim of international conspiracy. The Thanksgiving meal lasted for hours, far longer than typical camp meals. As plates were cleared and replaced with pie slices, the conversations between American soldiers and German prisoners deepened beyond polite small talk. The abundance of food had created a relaxed atmosphere where harder truths could be spoken. At Greta's table, Private Brenner had been joined by two other soldiers, Private Morrison from Iowa and Corporal Henderson, a medic from Pennsylvania. The conversation had turned inevitably to the war and what would happen when it finally ended. Morrison addressed the question to the German women through Brenner's translation. "Do you want to go home when this is over?" Anna answered first, her English improving enough that she could speak directly. "Home is gone. My city, Cologne, the letters from Red Cross say it is mostly rubble. My family, I do not know if they live. What is home when everything you knew is destroyed?" Corporal Henderson nodded slowly. "That is the tragedy of war. It does not just kill people. It kills the places and the certainties that made people feel safe in the world. I have seen it in France, the way entire towns just ceased to exist." Another German woman, Margaret Stein, spoke up in halting English. "But also, home is destroyed in different way. We thought we knew what Germany was, what it stood for. Now we learn about the camps, about the murders, about things so terrible we cannot speak of them. How do we go back to a country that did such things?" The American soldiers exchanged glances, recognizing the genuine anguish in her voice. This was not the defiant denial they had encountered from male German prisoners who refused to believe reports about concentration camps. These women were grappling honestly with information that destroyed their understanding of their own identity. Captain Reynolds, who had been moving through the mess hall, stopped at their table and addressed the group. "This is why we feed you well, why we treat you with respect. Not because we have forgotten what Germany did, but because we refuse to become the monsters we are fighting against. America wants to prove that democracy and human dignity can defeat tyranny and hatred. Every meal we share with you is part of that proof." Through Mrs. Schneider, who had joined the conversation, he continued, "When this war ends, we will need Germans who understand that there is another way to live, who have seen that strength does not require cruelty, that abundance can be shared rather than hoarded, that former enemies can become friends. You women may be among the first Germans to truly understand what America represents." Greta felt tears sliding down her face again, becoming a common occurrence since her capture. "We were taught that strength meant hardness, that compassion was weakness, that Germany had to be ruthless to survive in a hostile world. But you show us every day that this is a lie." December brought the first snow to Camp Butner, transforming the compound into something that reminded the German women painfully of home. They stood at the barracks windows, watching white flakes drift down, each one carrying memories of German winters, of families gathered around meager fires, of children who had grown up knowing only war and privation. The contrast between those memories and their current reality had become impossible to ignore. Greta had begun keeping a diary, writing in German, during the quiet evening hours. Her entries traced a journey from confusion to understanding, from denial to acceptance of truths she had spent her entire adult life refusing to see. She wrote about the peach cobbler that had started everything, about Corporal Washington's kindness, about the Thanksgiving feast that had demonstrated American values more clearly than any propaganda could have refuted them. But she also wrote about the weight of her new understanding, the burden of recognizing that she had been complicit, however unknowingly, in something monstrous. The German women had access to American newspapers now, and they read with growing horror about the liberation of concentration camps, about the systematic murder of millions, about atrocities committed in Germany's name. Some women, like Liesel, still insisted these reports were exaggerated or fabricated. But most, like Greta, could no longer maintain such comfortable denial. The evidence was too overwhelming, too consistent, too detailed to dismiss as enemy propaganda. Anna had stopped eating for 2 days after reading about Auschwitz. She sat in the mess hall staring at the abundant food, unable to reconcile American plenty with German horror. How could these two realities exist in the same world, in the same war? How could she have been serving a government that starved and murdered millions, while America fed even its prisoners with casual generosity? Dr. Patricia Morrison, the camp's psychologist, had been brought in to speak with the German women who were struggling most profoundly with these revelations. She was a woman in her 40s, educated at Columbia University, and experienced in helping people process trauma and moral injury. Through Mrs. Schneider's translation, she explained concepts that the German women had never encountered in their rigid, authoritarian education. What you are experiencing is called cognitive dissonance, Dr. Morrison said during a group session. It is the psychological distress that occurs when your beliefs are contradicted by undeniable evidence. Your minds are trying to reconcile what you were taught with what you are learning, and the gap between them is causing you genuine pain. Greta listened carefully, finding comfort in having a name for the turmoil inside her. How do we live with this knowledge? She asked. How do we accept that we served evil while believing we were serving good? Dr. Morrison's answer was measured and thoughtful. You start by recognizing that you were victims of a massive deception, even as you acknowledge that you bear some responsibility for not questioning more deeply. You were taught not to think critically, not to ask difficult questions, not to trust your own moral instincts. That was not an accident. Totalitarian systems require people to surrender their individual judgment. She paused, letting Mrs. Schneider translate fully before continuing. The camp administration had established a letter-writing program allowing the German women to attempt contact with family members through the International Red Cross. Greta sat at a table in the common room, blank paper before her, trying to find words that could bridge the impossible distance between her old life and her current reality. How could she explain to her mother and sister, if they still lived, what she had learned in American captivity? Around her, other women struggled with the same impossible task. Anna had written and discarded 5 drafts, each one failing to capture the complexity of what she needed to say. Margaret had given up entirely, sitting with her head in her hands, unable to face the prospect of explaining herself to family members who might still believe the lies she had finally seen through. The letters they did manage to write were careful, constrained by both censorship requirements and emotional impossibility. They could report that they were alive, healthy, and being treated well. They could ask for news of family members and home conditions. But they could not write the truth that burned inside them, that everything they had believed was false, that they had been fools and tools of evil, that American captivity had freed them in ways their own country never had. Greta's final draft was brief and inadequate. Dear Mama and Elsa, I am alive and well in America. I am being treated with kindness I do not deserve. I pray you both survive the bombing and the chaos. I have learned things I wish I did not know, and I am no longer the daughter and sister who left Dresden to serve the Reich. I hope someday I can explain, but I do not have words now. Please know that I love you, and I am ashamed. Your Greta. She sealed the envelope knowing it would likely never arrive, that the address in Dresden might lead to nothing but rubble, that her family might be among the countless German dead. But writing it had been necessary, an acknowledgement that her old life deserved recognition, even as she accepted it could never be reclaimed. Private Brenner, who often helped with translation and communication, noticed the women's distress over their letter-writing attempts. He approached Captain Reynolds with a suggestion that the captain initially resisted, but eventually approved. A special evening session where the German women could speak freely about their feelings without censorship or judgment, with the understanding that their words would not be recorded or reported. That evening, 15 women gathered in the common room. Dr. Morrison facilitated, with Mrs. Schneider translating. The captain had insisted on being present, feeling it was his responsibility to hear whatever the women needed to say. What emerged over the next 3 hours was a collective unburdening of guilt, shame, confusion, and grief. The women spoke of their recruitment into auxiliary service, of their genuine belief that they were defending Germany against unjust enemies. They described the gradual erosion of that certainty, the small moments of doubt they had suppressed, the questions they had been afraid to ask. They talked about the peach cobbler, about how something as simple as a dessert had cracked open their certainty. Christmas of 1944 approached with the same generous spirit that had characterized Thanksgiving. The German women had been at Camp Butner for 2 months now, and the transformation in their appearance was remarkable. They had gained healthy weight, their skin had cleared, their hair had regained shine. Proper nutrition had restored them physically, even as their psychological journey remained turbulent and unresolved. Captain Reynolds had authorized the women to create Christmas decorations, and they threw themselves into the project with an enthusiasm that surprised even themselves. They cut paper snowflakes, created wreaths from pine branches gathered outside the compound, and taught American soldiers German Christmas carols. The cultural exchange felt natural now, comfortable in a way that would have been unthinkable when they first arrived. Corporal Washington had been planning his Christmas menu for weeks. He wanted to create something that honored both American traditions and German memories, a meal that would serve as a bridge between the women's past and present. On Christmas Eve, he prepared sauerbraten, using a recipe his grandmother had learned from German neighbors in Georgia, serving it alongside traditional American sides. When the German women entered the mess hall that evening and smelled the familiar scent of sauerbraten, several began crying before they even sat down. It was a gesture of recognition, an acknowledgement that their culture and memories had value even though their country had committed atrocities. Washington had somehow understood that they needed this reminder that being German was not the same as being Nazi, that their heritage contained beauty and worth despite recent history. Greta found Washington after the meal and spoke to him in her much improved English. "Thank you for remembering we are human, that we had lives and families and traditions before all of this. Thank you for not making us forget who we were, even as we learn to become different." Washington nodded, understanding the depth of what she was trying to express. "My grandmother used to say that healing requires remembering the good, along with acknowledging the bad. You cannot build a new self on nothing but shame and denial. You have to know what is worth keeping from your past, even as you reject what was evil." The Christmas celebration continued into the evening with singing, both German and American songs. Private Morrison played harmonica, while Sergeant Chen attempted to teach everyone a Chinese folk song his mother had taught him. The mess hall became a space where different cultures met not in conflict but in recognition of shared humanity. But the comfort of the evening could not completely erase the questions that haunted the women. News from Europe continued to worsen. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, Germany's last desperate offensive, and reports indicated massive casualties on both sides. The women worried about brothers, fathers, cousins who might be dying in the snow while they sat in warm American barracks eating generous meals. Margaret expressed what many felt during a quiet moment after the celebration. January 1945 brought bitter cold and deep introspection. The German women had now been in American captivity for 3 months, long enough that their previous lives had begun to feel distant and dreamlike. The routines of Camp Butner had become familiar, almost comfortable, and that familiarity itself created new anxieties. Were they betraying their country by adapting so easily to captivity, or had their country betrayed them long before capture? Greta had been assigned to work in the camp's administrative office, where her improving English and natural organizational skills made her valuable. She processed reports, filed documents, and inevitably saw information about the war's progress. Germany was collapsing. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years would barely last 12. The Soviet advance from the east was brutal and unstoppable. American and British forces pressed from the west. The cities she had known were being reduced to rubble. One afternoon, while organizing files, Greta discovered a folder containing photographs from newly liberated concentration camps. She knew she should not look, that these images were not meant for her eyes, but she could not stop herself. The photographs showed horrors beyond imagination: skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, mass graves filled with thousands of victims, survivors who looked more like ghosts than living humans. These were not enemy propaganda or exaggerations. These were official American military photographs, documented evidence of what Germany had done. Greta sat at the desk staring at the images until Captain Reynolds found her 20 minutes later. He saw what she was looking at, and his expression shifted from concern to something like compassion. He did not reprimand her for accessing files she should not have seen. Instead, he sat down across from her and spoke quietly. "This is what your country did, not what you personally did, but what the government you served committed in your name. You need to understand the full truth of it, the food we give you, the kindness we show. It is not because we have forgotten or forgiven these crimes. It is because we refuse to become like those who committed them." Greta looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "How can you stand to be kind to us? How can you feed us and treat us well when you know what our country did? We do not deserve your mercy." Reynolds was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Maybe you do not. Maybe none of us deserve mercy for the things our countries do. But America was founded on certain principles, and one of them is that every individual has dignity regardless of what their government does. You did not build these camps. You did not murder these people. You were a radio operator who believed she was defending her homeland. Should we punish you for crimes you did not commit?" "But I served the system that committed them," Greta said. "I wore the uniform. I followed orders. I believed the lies." "Yes," Reynolds agreed. "And now you know the truth, and you have to decide what you do with that knowledge." February brought the first serious discussions about the future. The war in Europe was clearly entering its final phase, and questions about repatriation had to be addressed. The War Department had sent guidelines for processing German prisoners for return to their homeland, but the situation with the women at Camp Butner remained complicated by their unique circumstances and obvious transformation. Captain Reynolds called a general assembly to discuss options with the women. Through Mrs. Schneider's translation, he explained that they would eventually be repatriated to Germany, but the timeline remained uncertain given the chaos in occupied territories. More importantly, he wanted to prepare them for what they would face upon return. "You have been here for 4 months," he said, "living in conditions very different from what you knew in Germany, and very different from what exists there now. You have had access to information about what your government did, and you have had time to process that information in relative safety. When you return, you will find a country that has been defeated and occupied, where food is scarce, where millions are displaced, and where denial and blame will be widespread. Anna raised her hand tentatively. Captain, what if some of us do not wish to return immediately? The question hung in the air, unexpected but not entirely surprising. Reynolds looked at her carefully before responding. Legally, you are prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention requires your repatriation once hostilities cease. I do not have authority to simply allow you to remain in the United States permanently. But hypothetically, Greta interjected in English, her confidence growing, if someone wished to immigrate to America properly, through legal channels after the war ends, would that be possible? Reynolds paused, considering his words carefully. The immigration system is complex, and I cannot make promises about what might be possible in the future. But I can say that America has historically been a nation of immigrants, and that people who demonstrate genuine commitment to democratic values and honest accounting of past wrongs might find opportunities here eventually. The conversation continued for over an hour, with various women expressing different feelings about their futures. Some, like Liesel, insisted they wanted to return to Germany immediately to help rebuild. Others, like Anna and Greta, admitted they felt increasingly disconnected from the country of their birth and drawn to the values they had encountered in America. Margaret spoke for several women when she said, through translation, "I do not know where I belong anymore. I am German, but Germany as I understood it no longer exists. Maybe it never existed except in propaganda and lies. Here in America, I have discovered parts of myself I did not know were there. I have learned to think critically, to question authority, to value individual dignity. Can I take those lessons back to Germany, or will returning erase everything I have learned?" April brought spring flowers and devastating news. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and Germany's unconditional surrender was imminent. The war in Europe would soon be officially over, and with that end would come the formal repatriation of all prisoners of war. Captain Reynolds received orders to begin preparing the German women for their return. The announcement was scheduled for May 8th, Victory in Europe Day. The compound gathered in the mess hall, American soldiers and German prisoners together, to listen to the official declaration that the war had ended. There was no celebration among the German women. They sat quietly, faces reflecting the complex emotions of people whose country had been utterly defeated, whose beliefs had been shattered, whose futures remained uncertain. After the official announcement, Captain Reynolds addressed the specific situation of the women prisoners. "You will be repatriated to Germany through displaced persons camps in Europe. Transportation will be arranged within the next 4 to 6 weeks. You will receive documentation of your prisoner status and treatment, which should help with your processing." He paused, his expression showing genuine emotion. "I want you to know that watching your transformation over these past 6 months has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my military career. You came here as enemies. You leave as friends, as examples of humanity's capacity for growth and change." Greta stood, her legs shaking but her voice steady. She spoke in English, her words carefully chosen. "Captain Reynolds, Corporal Washington, all of the American soldiers who have shown us kindness we did not deserve. We came here expecting cruelty and found compassion. We came here believing lies and found truth. We came here as Nazis and discovered we could become something better. Whatever happens to us in Germany, we will carry these lessons with us. We will tell people what we learned, how we were treated, what America truly represents." That evening, the German women gathered in their barracks for a difficult conversation. The question that had been building for months could no longer be avoided. Did they want to return to Germany? Could they return knowing what they now knew, feeling what they now felt? Anna spoke first. "I have no family left. My parents died in the bombing of Cologne. I have nothing to return to except rubble and strangers. Here, I have learned English, made friends, discovered work I find meaningful. Why should I choose devastation over possibility?" Other women nodded in agreement, but Margaret offered a different perspective. "If all the Germans who learned these lessons, who understand what went wrong, who know there is a better way, if we all stay in America, who will help rebuild Germany into something decent? Do we not have a responsibility to return, to try to teach what we have learned?" The decision divided the women in ways that reflected their deepest values and fears. Over the following weeks, as repatriation, procedures were organized, clear groups emerged. 14 women, including Greta and Anna, quietly approached Captain Reynolds with an unprecedented request. They wished to explore options for remaining in the United States, either through extended displaced person status or eventual immigration sponsorship. Their reasons varied, but shared common threads: lack of surviving family in Germany, fear of returning to a devastated homeland, and genuine transformation that made them feel more aligned with American values than German identity. 9 women, including Margaret, chose immediate repatriation despite knowing the hardships they would face. They spoke of duty to help rebuild, responsibility to family members who might still live, and a belief that Germany needed people who understood democracy and human rights to guide its reconstruction. They had been transformed by their American experience, but they would carry that transformation back to their homeland. Lazel and a handful of others remained trapped in denial, insisting until the end that the reports about concentration camps were exaggerated, that Germany had been unfairly defeated, that returning home would vindicate their beliefs. Captain Reynolds watched these women with sadness, knowing that they had learned nothing from their captivity except resentment. The camp administration worked to find sponsors for the women who wished to stay. Local families who had participated in the church outreach program stepped forward. The Henderson family offered to sponsor Greta, providing housing while she sought employment. Dr. Morrison arranged for Anna to continue work at the camp hospital with possibility of nursing school later. Others found placements with families throughout North Carolina and neighboring states. The process was complicated by legal uncertainties. These women were still technically enemy prisoners of war, and immigration law had not anticipated people in their situation. But the War Department, impressed by reports of their transformation and integration, agreed to reclassify them as displaced persons with provisional status. They would not be citizens immediately, but they would have the opportunity to build lives in America while pursuing naturalization through proper channels. On June 15, 1945, the day of departure arrived. The scene at Camp Butner was emotional and complex. The women who were leaving packed their few belongings, accepted care packages prepared by Corporal Washington, filled with food for their journey, and said goodbye to the Americans who had fundamentally changed their understanding of the world. Greta embraced Margaret, both women crying openly. "Tell them," Greta said in German. "Tell everyone in Germany what you learned here. Tell them that enemies can become friends, that strength does not require cruelty, that there is a better way to live." Margaret nodded. "And you remember where you came from. Do not forget you are German, even as you become American. We need Germans in America who understand both worlds, who can help build bridges between former enemies." The trucks arrived to transport the departing women to the port. Captain Reynolds stood at attention as they boarded, saluting them with the respect due to soldiers rather than prisoners. 25 years later, in 1970, Greta Hoffman Henderson stood in her kitchen in Charlotte, North Carolina, preparing peach cobbler for her daughter's birthday party. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, measuring flour and sugar, slicing Georgia peaches that her husband had brought home from the farmer's market. The recipe was Corporal Washington's, shared with her before he retired from the Army in 1952. They had remained friends over the decades, their bond forged in that strange time when enemy and captor had discovered shared humanity. Greta's daughter, Margaret, named for both Captain Reynolds and Greta's mother, helped with the preparation. At 16, Margaret had heard her mother's story many times, but never tired of it. The tale of how a simple dessert had begun the transformation that led to everything. Greta's American citizenship, her marriage to David Henderson, the family they had built together. "Mom, do you ever regret not going back to Germany?" Margaret asked as they worked. Greta considered the question carefully, as she always did. "I regret that I cannot know what happened to my mother and sister. I regret that I served, however briefly and unknowingly, a government that committed such evil. I regret the years lost to lies and hatred. But do I regret choosing America? No. This country gave me the chance to become someone better than I was, to build a life based on truth rather than propaganda, to raise a daughter who has never known what it means to be hungry or afraid or told that some people matter less than others." That evening, as family and friends gathered for the birthday celebration, Greta served her peach cobbler and watched people's faces as they tasted it. The same pleasure, the same satisfaction that she had seen in Corporal Washington's expression when he served it to confused German prisoners 26 years earlier. Food as a language of care, as a bridge between different worlds, as proof that abundance shared is better than scarcity hoarded. Anna had kept her promise too, becoming Dr. Anna Vogel after completing medical school and dedicating her career to treating underserved communities. She often said that every patient she helped was a small act of atonement for the sins of her youth, for the uniform she had worn and the government she had served. Margaret had returned to Germany and become a teacher, educating new generations about the dangers of totalitarianism and the importance of critical thinking. She corresponded regularly with Greta, their letters tracing the parallel paths of two women who had made different choices but shared the same. Transformation. The story of the German women prisoners who had been changed by American kindness, symbolized by something as simple as peach cobbler, became a footnote in history books. But for those who lived it, for the women who experienced that moment of cognitive dissonance when propaganda met reality, it remained the defining experience of their lives. It taught them that enemies are made, not born,